Chapter 25. Josie opened her eyes to a brightly lit room. Her room. She was home. She stretched her arms and legs. Everything seemed to be in working order. Her limbs no longer felt like they were made of lead. But when she pushed herself to a sitting position, her head pounded. She stilled until the worst of the pain passed. If Josie didn't know better, she'd think she was hungover. She hadn't drunk anything, though, had she? No, she would remember that. But something had happened. She glanced at her phone for the time. It was almost noon. Then stood, realizing she wore nothing but panties. She closed her eyes, vaguely remembering Shelley coaxing her to shift this way and that so she could slip off that silver gown. How humiliating! Josie pulled open her lower bureau drawer and chose a pair of workout shorts and a t-shirt. She needed to brush her teeth, and then she needed water, and then maybe coffee, and a shower, and then she'd figure out what had happened. She crossed the hallway into the bathroom, did her business, and then ambled barefooted toward the kitchen. She stopped at the entrance to the living room. She'd forgotten about Donley, but she wasn't surprised to see him. Thomas popped up from the club chair, Shelley from the couch, and Bentley from one of the kitchen chairs. Oh! Josie had no idea what they were all doing there. She needed to ask, but the pulsing in her head, the confusion spinning in her brain, kept the words trapped inside. Thomas gripped her arm as if to keep her from falling. "Are you all right?" She nodded. "I need something to drink." "I'll get it," Bentley said. He disappeared into the kitchen while Thomas urged her toward the table. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I did tequila shots. What happened?" "Somebody spiked your drink. Rohypnol." Josie collapsed into a chair as his words floated around in her brain, looking for a place to land. "The date rape drug?" Thomas's lips pressed together in a look of fury. "They gave you a lot. What do you remember?" She thought back, or tried to. "I remember trees, a white hallway, your voice and Shelley's." Shelley plopped down beside her. "We were so worried. Oh my gosh, I thought you were going to die." "It wasn't that serious, was it?" She turned from her overly dramatic friend to Thomas, thinking she'd see amusement there. She didn't. Bentley slid a glass in front of her and sat, looking as worried as the others. Josie took a long sip of the cold water. It tasted so good, felt so good on her parched throat. After a second sip, she asked, "Was it really that bad?" Her friends looked at each other. Thomas was the one to answer. "We took you to the ER. Your blood pressure was dangerously low, but they hooked you up to an IV and pushed fluids, and it went back up." "Dangerously low, like?" "Like if we hadn't gotten you to the hospital," Bentley said. "You might have died." "Or if you'd been drinking," Shelley added. "Thank God you weren't." "Seriously?" She looked at Thomas, waiting for him to contradict them. He only nodded. Their words, their worry. She tried to make sense of what they were saying, and then she realized, "You're saying someone tried to kill me?" Thomas's lips turned down at the corners. "The ER doctor said there wasn't an inordinate amount of the drug in your system. You just responded to it drastically." Oh. It was taking her too long to process what they were saying. "If a bottle tells me to take 2 pills, I usually take a half. I've always been ultra-sensitive to medication." "That explains it." Thomas nodded to her glass. "Drink your water. The sooner you flush that poison out of your system, the better. I assume you feel a little hungover." "A lot, yeah." "You need a Tylenol, food?" "Toast." Shelley popped up and disappeared into the kitchen. Josie sipped her water, recalling the strange events of the evening before, trying to discern the actual from the dreams. She'd kissed Thomas. That was real. They'd danced. Also real. She and Bentley had danced, and she'd told him she didn't think it was going to work between them. Bentley had looked heartbroken. Very real. And then things got murky. Had she asked Thomas to kiss her again? Ugh. Hopefully Bentley hadn't been there for that. She'd already hurt him enough. She remembered a car ride, voices, and then... I had the strangest dream, she said. Someone was in my room, telling me to tell my father something. To vote yes, I think. I guess it was just my mind trying to make sense of what happened. Thomas was nodding. Bentley was watching her. Neither seemed concerned, which made her feel better. That had been a dream, of course. Only a dream. She nibbled the toast Shelley brought for her, swallowed half a Tylenol, and then returned down the hall to take a shower. Her friends all looked exhausted, but they didn't seem ready to leave yet. Still, she needed to be alone, to wake up, to think. The hot shower revived her a little. She considered what her day should look like. The coffee shop was probably busy. She'd planned to get up and help with the preparations for the holiday. Hopefully, Kinsley and Marcel had managed everything without her. After she dressed, she'd go downstairs and check in with them. With the headache held at bay, she figured she might have a couple of hours of work in her before exhaustion overtook her. Wearing her bathrobe, she crossed the hallway to her bedroom, hearing no voices from the living room, despite the fact that there were 4 people in there. What had the night been like for Thomas, Bentley, and Shelley as they hovered over her, worried for her? The 3 of them didn't exactly get along. She hoped it hadn't been too rancorous. She yanked open her underwear drawer. There, on top of her neatly folded panties, sat a small envelope. With shaking hands, she lifted it, pulled out a plain white note card, and read the words. In case you forgot our conversation, here's the message to your father. No matter where she goes, no matter what she does, we can get to her. Vote yes. A scream crawled up to Josie's mouth from the depth of fear. She tried to stop it, tried to clamp it down, but it escaped in a burst of sheer panic. She had no more control over it than over the nausea that rose behind it. She dropped the note and bolted to the bathroom, where she emptied the contents of her stomach into the toilet. She heard her friends coming down the hall, knew when they were standing at the open door. One of them stepped in, closed the door, and crouched down beside her. What happened? Shelley asked. Josie couldn't say it aloud. Surely it wasn't real. Maybe she was hallucinating. Was that a side effect of the date rape drug? Hallucinations after it wore off? She prayed so. Hallucinating was better than the alternative. When she felt able, she stood and brushed her teeth. Shelley was uncharacteristically quiet beside her. Josie nodded to the door. Let me just get dressed. Maybe the note wouldn't be there. Maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. Even if it was there, Josie would be better able to face it once she was clothed. A bathrobe didn't exactly dispel the feeling of vulnerability. Josie crossed the hallway into her room. The note was there, lying on the floor like a serpent ready to strike. She ignored it as she pulled on a pair of capris and a t-shirt. Only after she slipped her feet into sandals, sort of feeling like herself again, did she bend over and scoop up the paper. Her friends were standing between the kitchen table and the back of the sofa, talking softly. They turned when she walked in, concern etched on their features. She ignored them and walked to Donley, who stood near the door. Did you hear me tell them about my dream? That somebody came into my room, told me to tell my father to vote yes? The man's eyebrows lowered. He nodded once. Josie handed him the note. Donley's face, always a mask of confidence, took on a hard quality. The bodyguard yanked his phone from his pocket, jabbed the screen, and said, Lake, we have a problem. Get over here. What is it? Shelley spoke, but it was Thomas who hurried across the room, his eyes boring into hers. What happened? He asked. Josie settled on the sofa, feeling weak as a newborn foal, and pulled a throw blanket over her. Someone was in my room last night. Thomas's eyes popped wide. He rounded on Donley, who stared back with an unreadable expression. You and your partner have one job, to keep her safe. Under your watch, she was drugged, and then someone snuck into her room. His words faded, and he turned back to Josie. Did he hurt you? Did he? She knew what Thomas was asking. Rohypnol wasn't called the date rape drug for nothing. I remember him crouching over me. He held my shoulders down so I couldn't move. She rubbed the spot, wondered if there were bruises where he'd touched her. She hadn't seen any, but she hadn't been looking. He talked to me, told me what's on that note." She glanced at Donley, who had the phone pressed to his ear again. Who was he talking to? Lake, someone else. The whole thing felt surreal. I didn't think I should have screamed or something, but I thought. She swallowed all her excuses. Truth was, she'd been high as the clouds. They all knew that. Then he pulled the covers up. The blankets. They hadn't been over her. She'd had on nothing but her panties. Humiliation rolled over her, and she closed her eyes and hid her face from Thomas, from everyone. Not that she'd had any control over the events, but she couldn't have held that mortification at bay for anything. She'd never understood why rape victims felt guilty, as if they'd done something wrong. Now, as shame heated her cheeks and burned in her middle, she understood. A warm hand enveloped hers. "You're okay." Thomas's voice was deep, his presence beside her reassuring. "The Lord protected you." Had he? It seemed, if he'd wanted to protect her, he might have alerted somebody to the fact that an intruder was in her room. She opened her eyes to Thomas, kneeling at her side, Bentley and Shelley behind him. Thomas leaned closer. He took her hands in his and rested his forehead against hers. "Father, we come to you, knowing you know everything that happened, everything they're still planning. We thank you for protecting Josie from what could have been much worse. We ask you to continue to protect her, keep her enemies at bay, expose their deeds, give her father wisdom, give each of us wisdom to know how to fight these evil people, to accomplish your will. We trust you with this, Lord." Thomas squeezed her hands, and she squeezed back, feeling slightly less afraid, slightly less off-kilter. Maybe that was the best she could hope for at the moment. After Thomas ended the prayer, he leaned back, and Josie caught sight of her friends behind him. Shelley looked bewildered. Bentley had the same look he'd worn the night before, when they'd danced, when she'd tried so hard to let him down easy. She'd told him the truth, that she didn't want to return to politics and couldn't imagine him being happy elsewhere, and that, even if he could, she couldn't imagine sharing her life with somebody who didn't share her faith. He looked away, the dismay in his expression morphing into something else, something darker. Before she could name it, a knock sounded on the door. Donley looked out, then opened it to let Lake in. A uniformed police officer followed the bodyguard inside. It was the one who'd responded after Josie's car alarm had sounded, after the first time she'd been threatened. "Officer Tyler, ma'am, I understand you had trouble last night?" She directed him to sit in the adjacent chair and explained everything that had happened from when she'd started feeling off the previous night until she'd discovered the note a few minutes before. "We're already aware of the suspected drugging," he said. "We're having the contents of your glass analyzed. There were 3 sets of prints on it, the bartender's, the server's, and yours." "How do you have mine?" "You were fingerprinted when you were arrested." "Oh, yeah. What a red letter month I'm having." The cop's face softened for a brief moment. Then he pushed to his feet. "We'll just have a look around." She considered getting up to follow him, but she didn't have it in her. Instead, she rested her head against the back of the sofa and closed her eyes. The cushion shifted, and she turned to see Bentley beside her. Thomas was on the far side of the room, a phone pressed to his ear. Shelley slipped out of the apartment, also on the phone. "How you holding up?" Bentley asked. "Tired." "I bet." He sat there a moment, and she relished the silence. She wanted to shoo everybody out, turn on Turner Classic Movies, or maybe the Golf Channel, and take a nap. A long nap, maybe one that lasted until this horrible day was over. "I'm going to have to call your father and update him." "You told him about last night?" she asked. "We talked when you were still in the ER. He's called me about 20 times today to find out how you're doing. He wants you to get in touch when you feel up to it. I didn't tell you before because I'm not really up to it. He wants to come here. He said your mother was ready to hop in the car and start driving last night. Your dad barely talked her out of it." Josie could imagine the scene. Mom loved and supported Dad and his career, but her life had been devoted to raising and protecting her children. Now she spent hours every week with Alton's kids, reveling in the role of grandmother. If Mom thought her daughter might be in danger, Josie hated to think of her parents fighting about Mom coming to New Hampshire or fighting about Dad's vote on the bill. Dad had to do what was best, even if it was hard. Some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth dying for. Part of her wanted her mother to come. Mom would wrap Josie in her arms, comfort her, protect her. Mom would lay down her life to protect Josie. Which was why, though Josie might want her mother close by, she wouldn't ask her to come. The last thing Josie or her father wanted was Mom in the line of fire of these horrible people. "You could always go there," Bentley said. "Your father's hired an entire team of bodyguards. You could hang out with your mother until the vote is called. They're not going to bring it to the floor until they know they have the votes, and they're not going to get the votes unless Dad changes his mind. I'd have to stay there until November, and that's only assuming they wouldn't bother to get it passed with a lame duck Senate, which assumes our party loses the majority. Fine then, you'd stay until January. At least you'd be safe." Bentley shifted to better face her. "Which I don't think you are here. I don't know how they got to you at the party last night, or how they got in, but these people are relentless. Your plan to hide out in this town isn't working," Bentley said. "They know where you are, and nobody here seems able to protect you. You have to see that." She did see it, she did. But she didn't want to leave Coventry. And would she really be safer at her parents' townhouse in Georgetown, or back at their family home? "This is about Dad's vote." She lowered her voice and leaned in. "And we both know it's about more than that. Mitchell's been biding his time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to repay me for what I did." "What we did," Bentley said. True, they'd been in on the scheme together. But, though Bentley was an important member of Dad's staff, to the outside world, he was a typical staffer, interchangeable with any number of well-educated, hard-working political wannabes. Josie, though, Josie was the senator's daughter. Hers was the name Mitchell would have recognized, the face he would have remembered from countless events over the years. Josie was the one he held responsible, and she was responsible. That Bentley was too, was irrelevant. "The real question is, would I be safe there?" she asked. "Or would I just put the rest of my family in more danger?" "You're too vulnerable here." Bentley ignored the second part of her question. "This apartment isn't secure. Josie, if last night had turned out differently, if you hadn't survived, your father would never forgive himself, and your mother might never forgive him. This isn't just about you. Your entire family depends on you staying safe." Did they, though? Because, though Josie knew her parents loved her, she also knew they were strong people, people of principle. If the worst happened, Dad would do the right thing, and continue to do the right thing. Josie's parents would rise to the challenge, no matter what happened. But Josie didn't plan to be a casualty in this war. She just had to figure out how to fight back. "Ma'am?" Josie dozed on the sofa, though not nearly long enough. Had she really thought she'd be able to work today? She could still barely think straight. She'd called downstairs. Marcel had been full of questions and concerns. Apparently, everybody in town had heard some version of the events of the night before. Once she'd convinced him she was recovering, he'd assured her that he and Kinsley had the shop in hand. Officer Tyler stepped into her line of vision, the other officer behind him, the one who'd arrested her. Something. Fondue? No, he wasn't dip. Fontaine? Officer Tyler crossed to the far side of the coffee table and stood in front of the television. "You remember my partner, Officer Fontier?" Fontier. "Right." "Yes." "Hi." Fontier spoke. "You have a trellis against the back of your house. I'm guessing somebody climbed that to your bedroom window. That old wooden thing? Is it really strong enough to support a man's weight?" Fontier nodded. "Tested it myself. It's sturdy." "But how did they get inside?" Bentley had left her alone to sleep and now stood behind the couch. "The window was locked." "Maybe," Fontier said. "There are markings on the wood that tell me somebody used a tool to get in. Those old windows aren't exactly secure." Bentley's gaze snapped to Josie. "I thought you got a security system." "I did, but I didn't have the second-floor windows wired. I thought. Her gaze skimmed the room. It never occurred to me that someone would break in that way. And with the bodyguards here. Bentley glared at Donley. The bodyguards who weren't doing their jobs. Before Donley could respond, Josie said, "Don't do that. This wasn't their fault. It was somebody's fault!" Bentley's shout reverberated in her brain. "You have hired bodyguards who did nothing to stop this." "Sit down," Officer Tyler said in his no-nonsense cop voice. Bentley rounded the sofa and settled beside her. The police officer spoke over their heads. "You too, Windham." Thomas came around the opposite side of the sofa and sat in the club chair. From the look on his face, he was as furious and concerned as Bentley. Officer Tyler focused on Fontier. "You're sure it was forced open?" The younger cop said, "Not 100%, no. Somebody definitely used a pry bar to lift the bottom sash, but that might have been necessary regardless. It's hard to lift a window without a handle." "But the lock?" Tyler asked. The other cop shrugged. "It's possible to stick a tool between the two sashes and jimmy the lock open. Either that or it was unlocked." "We check the locks every time we come," Lake said. Officer Tyler turned to Josie. "Who had access to your apartment yesterday?" Josie looked around at the people who'd worked so hard to protect her. Was one of them her enemy? She couldn't believe it. She wouldn't. "Lake and Donley," she said, nodding to her bodyguards. "And Bentley and Shelley." Officer Tyler looked around. "Shelley is—" "I'm right here." She stepped into the apartment. "I was on the phone." She lifted her cell. "I didn't want to interrupt. Bentley, Josie, and I were all here yesterday afternoon. Josie and I were getting ready for the fundraiser. Bentley was just hanging around." "I was your escort," Bentley said. "I wasn't just hanging around. I'm trying to keep her safe." "Well done," Shelley said. "Really, fine job." He might have retorted, but Josie laid a hand on his forearm. She didn't have the patience for their sniping today. "I can't imagine either of them working against me," Josie said. "Maybe somebody broke in the front door while we were out and unlocked the window." Tyler said, "You have a security system. Did your alarm go off?" "No." "Did you set it?" "I always set it." "She did," Bentley added. "I remember distinctly." "You were standing right behind her." Shelley said the words slowly, as if working something out in her head. She moved into the circle, standing between Fontier and Lake, but her focus never left Bentley. "You watched her set it. You must know the code." "I knew the code anyway." Bentley waved Shelley's words off like an irritating fruit fly. "It's the same one we used at our place in D.C. Our place." She wished he hadn't said that. What would Thomas think? She didn't have the courage to look his way to find out. Not that she didn't have more important things to worry about. "You disappeared during Thomas's speech, Bentley, and for much of the next one." Shelley blinked twice, then shook her head slowly. "I got a phone call," he said. "What do you think? I jogged back here in my tuxedo? I don't even have a key. Come on." He looked at Josie. "She's not making sense. Even if I could have gotten in, I was gone for like 5-6 minutes." Before Josie could respond, Shelley spoke again. "It was longer than that, and I don't want to say this." She looked away from Bentley, meeting Josie's eyes. "Last night, Bentley and I danced. He was pretty upset about—" Josie shook her head quickly, hoping her friend wouldn't tell the entire room that Josie'd broken his heart the night before. Nobody needed to know about their conversation. Shelley looked at Bentley. "I'm sorry, I have to tell her. Tell them." "Even if I'd come back here and broken in, Lake and Donley check the windows whenever they get here." He turned to Lake. "Were the windows locked?" The woman nodded, but the motion was slight. "You're sure?" Tyler asked. She opened her mouth, cringed as if pained, and said, "I think so." "You think so?" Donley asked. "You aren't sure?" Lake turned to Josie. "You were pretty out of it. Ms. Sanders and I helped you back to your room. I was out of my routine. I can't remember if I checked the locks or not." Shelley turned back to Bentley. "So you could have unlocked them." "I didn't." "I have to tell them." Bentley gave her a hard look. That has nothing to do with anything. What? Josie asked. What are you two talking about? Shelley shifted to face Josie. He bought a house in Fairfax. Bentley's head dropped forward. Shelley kept talking. A really expensive house for you. He thought you'd like it there, out of the city. He thought maybe. Okay, Josie said. I'm not sure what that has to do with. He also bought a new car. Right, Bentley? That one outside. A Mercedes or. It's a BMW, Bentley said. What about it? Josie's empty stomach churned. She caught up, and she didn't like where Shelley was going with this line of thought. It's just. Shelley's gaze flicked around the room. She seemed uncertain. Where did you get the money for those things? I work, Bentley said. Most of the world does. They trade their time and talents for money. It's called a job. You should try it sometime. I have a job, Bentley, but I couldn't afford a house in Fairfax on what I earn. Maybe you should get a better job. Shelley ignored his jab and gave Josie an imploring look. I'm just saying, he's not exactly wealthy. Would his income cover a new car and a 3-bed, 2-bath in Fairfax? Before Josie could answer, Bentley shifted to face her. You remember Aunt Bernie, the one in Louisiana? The one who owned all the land? I remember, Josie said. She died last winter. She left me an inheritance. I didn't tell you about the house because I wanted to surprise you. I thought, when you came home with me. His Adam's apple bobbed, and he turned to Shelley. This is what I get for trusting you. Somebody's working against her. Shelley focused on the cop. I'm not saying it's Bentley, but you need to check out his story. Because the guy doing all of this is well-funded, and maybe he paid Bentley to. To what? Bentley shot to his feet. Do you really think I'd hurt Josie? She almost died last night. Okay, let's settle down. Officer Tyler's words were calm and firm. Bentley sat again and gave Josie an imploring look. I would never hurt you. She didn't respond. Couldn't think of anything to say. He'd driven the BMW to New Hampshire, so she'd known about it. She'd figured purchasing the luxury car had put him pretty deep in debt. Bentley's great-aunt was a widow whose husband had died early in their marriage. They hadn't had children, so Josie wasn't surprised to learn she'd left Bentley money, but enough to buy a luxury car and a house in a market where a typical single-family home would cost well over $500,000? You don't believe me. Bentley's tone held incredulity and no small measure of hurt. You really think I'd do this to you? I don't know what to think. She stood, needing space, needing air. She scooted past Thomas and rounded the sofa. You show up here out of the blue, years after we broke up. You broke up, not we. Bentley stood and talked over the back of the sofa. I missed you. I wanted you back. That's what you said. I love you, Josie. He didn't seem to care who heard him say it. The 2 cops, the 2 bodyguards, and Shelley were watching. Thomas sat with his forearms propped on his thighs, gaze on the floor. She wondered what he was thinking. Maybe he was judging her, judging all of this, and realizing he'd been an idiot to have gotten involved with her. Or maybe he was praying. She hoped so. God knew they needed all the help they could get. I bought the house for you, Bentley said. I thought maybe. I bought it before I came here. If I'd realized how much you love Coventry, I wouldn't have done it. I've already put it on the market. Hopefully I can sell it for a profit, or at least get my money back. I didn't understand how much you loved it here. I didn't understand the life you'd built here. I'd hoped. His voice faded. After a moment, he said, Please tell me you believe me. I don't know, Bentley. Shelley stepped around the sofa. I believe you want her back. No question. She slid her warm fingers over Josie's arm. He never thought he was good enough for you. After you left him and left the city, he confided to me that he thought you deserved someone from your. How did you put it, Bentley? Her station. Bentley's face paled. Please, don't. She needs to know. That has nothing to do with this. I never wanted to. Shelley clamped her lips closed. Then she swallowed. I think you'd do anything you could to win her back, even if it meant getting in bed with the worst kind of people. You and I both know. Don't. Bentley's voice lost the imploring tone. Now it was hard, his brows low, his glare threatening. Don't! The two stared at each other for a long moment. Josie's heart thumped wildly. She needed to sit, but there was something passing between her ex-fiancé and her best friend, something she couldn't comprehend, something she needed to understand. Finally, Shelley tore her eyes away from Bentley and faced Josie again. After you left, we were both. She licked her lips, swallowed, her eyes filled. It was hard on us when you left. He was heartbroken, and so was I. You and I have been best friends our whole lives, and all of a sudden, you just wrote me out of your life. I didn't, Josie said. I moved away. People do that. Fine. Shelley snatched her hand off Josie's arm and swiped at her tears. Okay, people do that. But the way you did it, the way you turned your back on me. She looked at the floor, shook her head. I was hurt. I never meant for that to happen. You had your own life. I didn't realize. Josie looked at her friend a long time, then at Bentley. Neither would meet her eyes, and she knew. You two? Just for a couple of months. Shelley's gaze snapped up. We were both lonely. We commiserated. Bentley? When he looked up, it was to glare at Shelley. When we were together, Shelley said, we both knew it was about you, about missing you. He admitted to me that he'd do anything to get you back. I think. She pulled her phone from her pocket and turned it over in her hands a couple of times. I have a friend who works for Mitchell. She told me Bentley's on their payroll. Bentley took a step toward Shelley. That's a lie. I would never. He turned to Josie. I would never do anything to hurt you. I love you. But you thought she rejected you because you're not rich, Shelley said. Because you come from, your words, redneck roots. Defying his stoic expression, red crept up his neck and into his face. You can't really believe that about me, Josie said. What happened between us had nothing to do with your family. Bentley's lips pressed closed. So I'm guessing you agreed to work for Mitchell. Shelley said the words fast, as if forcing them out. You came up here, figured you could play protector, and win her back, all while trying to encourage her father to vote for the bill. You could make the money you felt you needed to be worthy of her. One stone, lots of birds. Bentley had suggested her father should vote for the bill. He turned his back on Shelley and reached for Josie's hands. Josie crossed her arms, but his eye contact never wavered. You know where my loyalty lies. I would never work against your father. Or you. And Mitchell. He shook his head. After everything he did, after everything we did, he wouldn't trust me any more than I'd trust him. Think it through, Josie. That was the problem, though. She couldn't think anything through. She couldn't think at all. She'd been drugged, bodily threatened. Her space and her privacy violated. And now she'd learned Bentley and Shelley had had an affair. Her best friend and her former fiancé. Not that they owed her anything. She'd left them both. Shelley was being overly dramatic, as usual, claiming Josie had abandoned her. But that was probably how Shelley felt, even if it wasn't true. And Josie'd broken Bentley's heart. Still, they'd had an affair, and they'd hidden it from her because it wasn't okay. How could she believe anything either one of them told her now? At least Shelley had fessed up. At least Shelley had been honest. Right up until Josie had guessed the truth, Bentley was trying to get Shelley to keep quiet. He stepped closer, tears in his eyes, his voice low. I love you. I would never do those things she said. But you did have a relationship with her. His eyes closed. Moisture leaked out of them. Despite the air conditioner pumping cold air into the space, the room felt sticky and stifling. Mr. Kent Officer Fontier crossed the space. We need you to come down to the station with us. Bentley stepped back and turned to the cop. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his voice was strong. Am I under arrest? We just want to ask you a couple of questions, Fontier said. Maybe you can clear up a few things? Bentley took 2 steps closer to Josie. stopping when they were close enough to touch, but he didn't reach for her again. I would never hurt you. I might not be religious like your new whatever. He aimed a glare at Thomas, though the other man didn't look up. But even I have my limits. She didn't know what he expected her to say. She had nothing. He watched her a long moment. Sir? Fontier said. Bentley broke eye contact and crossed the apartment. Lake opened the exterior door, letting bright afternoon light in, and Bentley stepped out, the cop on his heels. The door clicked shut. Shelley said, I'm so sorry. Josie, you have to know. You need to leave. Oh. Shelley blinked, wide-eyed. Josie, you have to forgive me. I will, eventually. But right now, I need peace, and having you here is anything but peaceful. You need to go. Her best friend looked crestfallen as she gathered her purse and followed Bentley and Officer Fontier out the door. Only after it closed did Thomas stand and round the sofa. He opened his arms, and Josie fell into them.
Chapter 26. Thomas savored the moment. Josie was curled up beside him, sound asleep. After Bentley and Shelley had left, he'd urged her to the couch where she'd wept on his shoulder. Afterward, to distract her from the cops coming and going, bodyguards having hushed conversations in the corner, and CSI people rifling through her bedroom, Thomas turned on Turner Classics. About 5 minutes later, she drifted off. But Zach, Thomas should probably call him Officer Tyler as long as the guy was in uniform, had already asked him once to step outside, and now he leveled that lowbrow cop look that meant, do what I say or pay the consequences. So Thomas eased Josie onto the sofa and laid a blanket over her. He followed the cop to the small stoop at the top of the stairs outside her apartment. The sun was falling behind the trees, and the evening air was cooling. The park was only a few blocks away, and the sounds from Liberty Fest carried. Somebody was already setting off firecrackers a block or two behind. He'd forgotten about the holiday. Tell me what you did last evening, Zach said. Maybe Zach and he hadn't been friends in school because Thomas bested him in just about every contest. Maybe because sophomore year, Serena Kane, Zach's big crush, had asked Thomas to the stupid Sadie Hawkins dance. He'd only said yes because he hadn't known how to say no without hurting her feelings. Zach and Serena had been dating by the time of the junior prom. Now they were married. The whole thing was ridiculous. Surely Thomas and Zach could get past high school rivalries now. What time exactly? They left here about 6:30, so from then on. I was at Liberty Fest all day, mostly at my campaign booth. The fundraiser began at 6:30, cocktails and appetizers, but I didn't have to be there until 7. Zach jotted something on his notepad. Thomas hadn't done anything wrong. There was no reason for him to feel nervous. On the other hand, Josie had sent both Shelley and Bentley away, and Bentley had been carted down to the station. Thomas would prefer not to be a suspect. A uniformed police officer stepped out of Josie's apartment. Lake at his side. She didn't meet his gaze as she walked past. What's that about? Thomas asked. Zach's expression didn't change. Apparently, the cop didn't feel the need to explain anything to Thomas, which made sense, he supposed. I'd planned to head home around 6, Thomas said, but it was almost 1:30 by the time I got away. I didn't have my car. You know how parking is at Liberty Fest. So I walked back to my office. I let myself into the apartment upstairs where I've been staying and… Why? Thomas wasn't sure what Zach was asking and waited for clarification. Before Zach could offer it, his phone rang. He glanced at the number, then connected the call. Tyler here. Though Thomas strained to hear, he couldn't pick up anything. Other noises didn't escape him, though. The stage from the night before would still be set up, though the tent would have been broken down. There were usually performances all day. At that moment, it sounded like an Irish band was playing. The show would continue until the fireworks began after sunset. Zach ended the call, a grim look on his face. What? Thomas asked. The lab won't get to Josie's glass and its contents for a few days at best, maybe a few weeks. But there's a quick test for rohypnol, and one of our people got her hands on a kit. It's not official, but from what I understand, it's very accurate. And there was no trace of the drug in her drink. How can that be? Thomas hadn't meant for his volume to rise and tempered it. I don't understand. At this point, there's zero evidence that anybody drugged her. Are you sure she didn't just drug herself? Is that something people use recreationally? Zach shrugged. You'd be surprised what people do. She doesn't even drink alcohol, and you think she gave herself the date rape drug at a public event? Come on, Zach. Why would she do that? Another shrug. You tell me. Thomas took a long, slow breath to keep his frustration from leaking out. She wouldn't. Somebody drugged her. We just don't know how. Zach watched him a long moment. Or you drugged her. Thomas met his old classmate's eyes. I didn't. And if you question the people from the fundraiser, you'll know that after Josie and I danced, I left the table and didn't return until she'd already been drugged. Zach glanced at the adjacent building that housed Thomas's agency and current home. Why have you been staying there? After those two guys threatened her, I wanted to be close. You always did have a hero complex, says the guy in the uniform with the gun. That elicited not so much a chuckle as a loud exhale. Okay, go on. I let myself into my apartment, took a shower, put on my tuxedo, and then drove back to the park. Why drive when you'd walked earlier? The parking wasn't as bad late in the day, which Zach should already know. And unlike earlier, I was wearing a tuxedo. Zach gave him a go-on nod. By the time I parked and walked to the tent, it was a little after 7. Andrew was introducing the mayor. Did anybody see you? Well, I was on stage, so yeah. Before that, I mean. Sure. He rattled off the names of the people he'd waved to during his walk from the car to the tent, thankful for his good memory. Before you left your apartment, you didn't stop by here to see if they were ready, Zach asked. Maybe see if you could give them a ride? We'd planned to meet at the park, and I knew they weren't here because Bentley's BMW wasn't parked in the driveway. For the first time in their conversation, Zach perked up. So you knew the place was empty? I don't have a key, and unlike Bentley, I don't know the alarm code, so I couldn't have broken in. Also, I barely made it back in time. Did anybody here see you when you left? Maybe Josie's customers? Yeah, I saw a couple of families I knew. He named a few locals he'd greeted, then mentioned Kinsley, Josie's employee, whom he'd waved to as he was driving away. You can ask all of them. Zach made notes, then snapped his notebook shut. There's one more thing, Thomas said. The newspaper said a waiter claimed Josie had been drinking whiskey all night. That was a lie. Her medical records showed 0 alcohol in her system. Did you get the same story? We did, Zach said. When we called him on it, the server claimed he had her confused with somebody else. Who? He said someone at your table. Nobody at my table was drinking whiskey. How do you know? Because they're my friends and I know what they drink. He spouted off the names of everybody who'd sat with them. Bentley was drinking scotch on the rocks. Shelley was drinking red wine. As far as I know, nobody else at our table drank anything alcoholic. Ask them. Zach's eyes narrowed. Gosh, is that how it works? Thomas's blood pressure ticked up. That server lied to you, and he lied to the reporter, who printed a story that was either intended to make Josie look bad, or me look bad, or both. I'd hate to see Mr. Perfect's reputation smeared. Don't be in... He swallowed the word dying to escape. I'd never seen the waiter before, but he was young, maybe 20. The point is, he was really quick to make up a story about Josie, somebody he didn't even know. Why would he do that? Zach said nothing. That server could very well have been the person who slipped the Rohypnol into Josie's drink. Assuming someone did, which at this point we can't prove. Someone drugged her. Maybe she drank the Dr. Pepper and the waiter brought her a fresh one. He should be a suspect. If he didn't do it, he was working for the one who did. I think if you find the server, you'll find the person who did this. Hold on while I write this down, Zach deadpanned. If only I had your investigative skills. We'd all be better off, Thomas snapped. Zach took a step closer, getting into Thomas's personal space. Believe it or not, I've actually investigated crimes before. We already know what happened. Rather than be irritated by Zach's aggression, Thomas asked, What? We put a little pressure on the kid, and he admitted that somebody paid him to say she'd been drinking. Who? He doesn't know. Got a message on Snapchat to tell anybody who asked that she'd been drinking whiskey and Coke, and the guy would pay him $1,000. And did you? We checked out his story. The message was gone. The waiter remembered the guy's name, but the guy had blocked him. We've contacted Snapchat. Our tech guy said somebody probably just opened a dummy account. We're probably not going to find him. And the money? Thomas asked. The $1,000 was left in an envelope in the waiter's mailbox. And yes, we dusted it for fingerprints. And no, there were none but the waiters. And yes, we charged him with obstruction of justice. There's no way to trace who the money came from? No cameras or... Nope. The newspaper plans to print a retraction. I wouldn't look for it on the front page. The publisher was an old friend of Farley's, so Thomas didn't expect fair coverage. He was more concerned about Josie. What's your theory about what happened? Zach backed to the far side of the landing and leaned against the railing, looking up at the building. I don't know what to think, whether the window was unlocked or not. I doubt it was, Thomas said. Donnelly and Lake seem pretty competent. Zach met his eyes. Unless you unlocked it. I didn't, and you know it. A moment passed. Yeah, I do. That was something. Zach might give Thomas a hard time, but at the end of the day, the men knew each other. Thomas knew Zach was a good cop who'd do his best to get to the bottom of what happened. Zach knew Thomas wouldn't knowingly put anybody in harm's way. What's your take on Bentley and Shelley? Zach asked. Thomas allowed himself to consider the question carefully before answering. I don't like Bentley. He's an arrogant, elitist jerk. To be fair, though, maybe my opinion is jaded. You've got that love triangle thing going on. But the guy's been doing everything in his power to not only win Josie back, but to protect her, and he works for her father. I don't see him risking either his relationship with her or his job to fill his bank account. So you don't think he's behind any of this? No, I don't. And Shelley? Thomas smiled. She loves Josie. As far as I can tell, she's completely devoted to her. Unlike Bentley, Shelley's got all the money she needs. What would be her motive? I don't know any of these people. How about the bodyguards? Thomas shrugged. I thought they were competent, but somebody drugged her drink, and Lake was standing right there. The words brought another idea. Did you check out the bartender? It was Shelby McCaffrey. Oh, Thomas hadn't glanced that direction all night. Shelby was the younger sister of Thomas's friend Fitz. What did she say? She just made the drinks. The servers delivered them. A few people came straight to the bar after the music started, but Josie wasn't one of them. For the most part, Shelby didn't know which drinks were for which guests, so even if she'd wanted to drug Josie, she wouldn't have been able to. And why would she? Thomas asked. Zach flipped through his notes briefly. Who was Bentley talking about earlier? Someone named Mitchell? You need to ask Josie about that. Suffice it to say, there are other elements involved. Things we need to know about. I don't disagree, Thomas said. Zach studied him. But you won't tell me. When Thomas said nothing, Zach asked, Who will? Josie could share the story, but she needed to rest and recover. I can give you a number for Josie's father's chief of staff, Carlisle Nichols. Carlisle? Zach flipped through his notebook. He's the one who hired the bodyguards. Chief of staff? Oh, yeah, Josie's father. She doesn't want anybody to know this. Someone could have killed her last night. Tell me who he is. Maybe he shouldn't, but finding whoever did this was more important than Josie's anonymity. Senator Davis Harrington. Zach jotted the name in his notebook. I don't know how much Carlisle will tell you, if anything, but he'd be the guy to ask. Thomas found the number in his contacts and showed it to Zach, who copied it down. Good, Zach said. We need to talk to him anyway. The bodyguards, my understanding is that Donnelly escorted you back here last night and then went to their hotel room to sleep. Lake stayed. Is that right? Yeah. You ever seen either of them back in her room? I know they both check all the windows and doors when they first arrive. Who did that last night? Lake. Donnelly just got us to the door and left. Other than that, have you seen either of them in her room? Lake went back there a few times. Shelley, too. We were all worried, but neither Bentley nor I felt we ought to go into her bedroom. That's the same story I get from them. By all accounts, Donnelly was nowhere near your table at the fundraiser, and he wasn't in the apartment last night either. We checked with the hotel, and the clerk saw him arrive at about 4:30 and leave again at about 11. He's been cleared as a suspect. Okay, good. You're looking into Lake? He nodded. And you'll be sticking close? Your girlfriend's obviously a target. She's not my girlfriend. Zach rolled his eyes. Whatever. Has she considered moving to a more secure location? She can be pretty stubborn. Can't they all? Zach cracked the first smile of the day, but he covered it fast. See if you can talk her into going to a hotel, preferably one outside of Coventry. You don't think there's a safe one in town? The cop's lips tipped up again. I just want her out of my jurisdiction. We've got enough to manage without having to chase her ghosts. Sorry to keep you from your holiday cookout. Don't lie. Zach clapped him on the shoulder. You're not one bit sorry. Josie was still asleep when Thomas stepped back inside. He was looking for something to make for dinner. She didn't have much when his cell rang. It was a local number he didn't recognize. Thomas Windham. Mr. Windham, this is Rebecca Street, Seer, Coventry News. Do you have a minute? He returned to the living room and looked over the sofa at Josie. Her breathing was steady. She'd be all right alone for a few minutes. Besides, Donnelly was standing watch at the door. Are you there? The woman said. Just a sec. He stepped outside. Sorry about that. What can I do for you? I understand we got the story wrong last night, that Josie Smith wasn't drunk but drugged. I wanted to give you the chance to set the record straight. Have you tried contacting Josie? Oh, I'll do that, but it's you the readers are most concerned with. She's not running for mayor after all. What do you want to know? We were told, and the police were too, that the woman you were with, Josie Smith. The trailing words sounded like a question, so Thomas said, Josie's a friend. If you say so. The woman's laugh sounded about as authentic as techno music. I wondered because there's a rumor you were seen kissing. You wanted to ask me a question? He wasn't going to discuss their kiss. Right, so you were with her, and the rumor was that she got drunk, so drunk that you had to carry her out of the tent. But we have now heard from a source at the police station that they analyzed the contents of her glass, and she was drinking Dr. Pepper. Do you want to explain what happened? Somebody slipped her Rohypnol. Somebody roofied her? I'm afraid so. We took her to the hospital because she had a really powerful reaction to the drug. She's fortunate she survived. Someone slipped her the date rape drug. Rebecca emphasized the word. Weren't you her date? Thomas started to speak, then stopped and considered her question. This woman was trying to pull him down a rabbit hole he figured would be filled with well-hidden snares. Like I said, we're friends. Of course you are! False enthusiasm if he'd ever heard it. Thomas's guard was rising fast. Everybody saw how you carried her out of there like a superhero, Rebecca said. I didn't mean to imply anything else. Do you have any idea where the drug came from? The police are working on that. Interesting. Interesting. I wonder if... She lowered her voice conspiratorially. I don't know if you've heard, Rebecca said, but people are saying that Farley has a woman on the side, a very young woman. What do you think about that? I prefer not to speculate about other people's relationships. So you agree that he is in a relationship with another woman? Thomas laughed, though it sounded about as genuine as the woman who heard it. I have no idea what Farley does in his spare time, and I don't spend time worrying about it. I'm focused on getting elected and how to be the best mayor for Coventry that I can be. I'm sure Farley is doing the same. Maybe. She batted the word like a tennis ball. Thomas let it fly out of bounds. Finally, Rebecca continued. I just wondered if maybe Farley was behind what happened to your girlfriend, trying to make you look bad. I mean, I know you would never stoop to anything like that, but Farley? She's not my girlfriend. Thomas closed his eyes, shot up a quick prayer for wisdom. Did you have a question? Of the two of you, you have to admit you are the more moral of the candidates, right? Like I said, Rebecca, I prefer not to talk about. Okay, but you attend church every Sunday. You're not the kind of guy to have a wife and a little something on the side. I haven't been blessed with a wife, but if I am, I certainly have every intention of being faithful. Unlike Farley. I didn't say that. But you agree that having a mistress isn't exactly moral, right? Listen, Rebecca, I'm not sure what you're getting at. The door opened and Josie stepped onto the porch. She looked sleepy, but she smiled at him. Donnelly stood behind her, scowling as if it was Thomas's fault she'd come outside. "Oh, come on," Rebecca said. "You can't really be afraid to answer that question. Even you can admit, if Farley is having an affair, that would make you the moral choice, don't you agree?" "I want what's best for Coventry." "I know, of course." She continued talking, saying how she knew Thomas was a great candidate, how she trusted him, laying it on thick. He put the phone on speaker so Josie could hear. Her smile faded, and she stepped closer. "And what's best for Coventry," Rebecca said, "is a candidate with a strong moral backbone, don't you think?" "Yeah, of course, but also, which makes you the moral choice." "Sure, I guess, but—" Josie yanked the phone from his hands. "Mr. Windham has nothing further to say on the matter." "That's okay." The reporter's voice, laced with glee, was loud enough that he could still hear it. "I got what I needed." Josie ended the call and closed her eyes. "What?" he asked. "She was trying to get you to proclaim yourself the moral candidate." "Yeah," he replayed the conversation. "I figured she was doing something like that, but I can't figure out why." Josie's eyes opened. "Where does she work?" "The local paper." "You have any contacts there?" At his nod, she said, "Reach out, see if you can find out what that was about." "I will, but I haven't done anything to be ashamed of." Her head bobbed, but not as if she agreed. "There was a reason for that phone call. We need to find out what it was and get ahead of it." They were in the back seat of Donnelly's SUV that evening. Thomas sneaked a look at Josie beside him. She looked tired, but otherwise no worse for wear. He'd been against this, but Josie had insisted she needed to get out of the house. They were on their way to a restaurant a half hour from Coventry, a place where neither of them should be recognized, a place that should be pretty quiet on the 4th of July. "You sure you feel okay?" Thomas asked. "Better than I felt all day." "You'd be safer if we'd stayed at your place or gone to my office." She gave him a look he was coming to recognize. Head tilted down, brows up, closed mouth frown. It meant I can take care of myself and maybe quit worrying. He could do that. If it meant he'd get to spend an evening with Josie, just the two of them, not counting the bodyguard in the front seat, he wasn't going to complain. The oversized vehicle twisted and turned through the thick forest toward Campton, a little town north of Coventry. The road was mostly deserted. Donnelly's gaze flicked to the rear view often, but he looked unconcerned. They traveled in uncomfortable silence for a few minutes. The SUV was big, but not big enough for the elephant seated between them. Thomas was tired of pretending it wasn't there. Might as well start small and work his way to it. "What do you think about Bentley being questioned?" She glanced his way. "At first it seemed ridiculous, the idea that Bentley could be trying to hurt me, going against my father." "At first?" "Shelley's right about him, about how he sees himself. His family wasn't poor, but they were definitely working class, a far cry from mine. His dad's a heat and air technician. His mom's a school secretary." "Both noble professions," Thomas said. "Definitely. But when you rub shoulders with the kinds of people we did in Washington, it can make people feel less than, I guess." "You don't have that problem." One shoulder lifted and fell. "An accident of my birth, nothing more. My family's wealth is certainly not anything I can take pride in. But Bentley doesn't understand that. He always felt like he had to compete, to measure up to some imaginary line." "You think it's possible he switched sides in order to reach that line?" She considered the question a long moment. "I wouldn't have. But the new car, the house, it's suspicious." "The inheritance?" "I know he inherited something. How much, I have no idea. The police will get to the bottom of that." "What does your gut tell you?" She smiled. "I'm not in the habit of consulting my gut. Sometimes we pick up on things instinctively that we don't understand intellectually." She shifted to face him better. "Interesting. So what does your gut tell you about Bentley?" He chuckled. "Waltzed right into that, didn't I?" She didn't answer, just waited. "So fine. Honestly, I can't see it. Bentley cares about you, and he obviously loves his job. Would he really risk both for money? I've known people to do worse, and we'd be talking a lot of money. I wouldn't have thought it of him, but now that I know about his relationship with Shelley, I feel like I don't know either one of them. Since Josie'd finally brought it up, Thomas asked the question that had been dogging him for hours. You say you don't want to get back together with Bentley, but when you found out he and Shelley dated, you had a pretty strong reaction. He remembered those moments as he'd held her close while she wept against his chest. Though he'd enjoyed the holding part very much, he hadn't loved that she'd been weeping for Bentley. It's just, you think one thing, and then you find out the truth is a totally different thing. He waited, sensing she needed time to figure out what she was trying to say. She shifted in the seat, facing forward again. For a while there, you seemed to be pursuing me. Her gaze flicked his way, but didn't linger. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say to that. Let's say, for argument's sake, you were still pursuing me, she said. He grinned, thinking of their kiss. I'll allow that, for argument's sake. Her lips twitched at the corners. Let's say you'd continued to ask me out consistently, making me feel like you really wanted to date me. Okay. And let's say maybe I start to think, Thomas might really like me. Sure, let's say that. And let's say I started to think maybe you were onto something when you suggested, if you had, she shifted to face him, gesturing back and forth between them, that we might be good together. I like this line of thinking. And then let's say maybe I decide that the next time you ask, I'll say yes. Which could happen in your theoretical world, now that I'm off the hook on the whole not asking thing. Exactly. He smiled and waited. She seemed to lose her train of thought, just watching him for a long moment. So let's say all of that, he prompted. Right. And then let's say I'm in the café one day and you walk in with a woman on your arm, maybe a friend of mine. Shelley? Her expression darkened. Let's not use Shelley in this scenario. Another friend of yours then. And you start dating her. How do you think that would make me feel? He shrugged. In your scenario, I don't really owe you anything. I mean, in your scenario, maybe we danced. Maybe. Maybe we shared a mind-blowing, life-altering kiss. Don't get ahead of yourself. At his raised eyebrows, she said, but maybe that, yeah. He chuckled. But a kiss isn't a commitment. We haven't even been on a date. We're friends, and all we've promised to be is friends. So I can date anyone I want. Exactly, and if it hurts me, well, that's my fault for not saying yes when I had the chance. Let's hope you've learned your lesson. But with Bentley, Thomas barely managed to contain a growl. He'd forgotten they were talking about another man. Bentley and I were engaged. When I ended our engagement, he acted like he was devastated. He tried to change my mind for months. I moved away, but he called me all the time. And then he came up here, trying to reconcile with me. He's been here for weeks. He's told me multiple times that he still loves me. He claimed he wants me back. And you've been considering that? He didn't phrase it as a question. No. Yes. Maybe, for a little while. I mean, here was this man who was willing to give up everything for me. He offered to quit his job, to move here to Coventry. You have to understand, politics is his dream. He loves it. He thrives in it. But he said he was willing to give it all up for me. What a hero. Thomas couldn't help the sarcastic undertone. Fortunately, Josie didn't seem to pick up on it. And all that time, it's not as if they dated. I would have heard if they'd been seen together around town, so they didn't go out together in public. They didn't tell anybody. They had an affair, a secret affair. My fiancé and my best friend. During those months when he was calling me, begging me to take him back, he was sleeping with Shelley. But you weren't together. I know that. So what's the problem? She sighed, the exhale long and tired. The problem is, he never would have told me. Though how he thought Shelley would be able to keep that secret indefinitely, I have no idea. Telephone, telegraph, tell Shelley. But the point is, he would have gotten back together with me. He would have married me, knowing all the while he'd betrayed me. But I know, Thomas, I know. We were broken up. Under the current rules of society, he should be able to do whatever he wants if we're broken up. It's like that old sitcom. We were on a break, Thomas quoted. Exactly. Except I understand now how the woman felt. If he really loved her, how could he sleep with someone else? Thomas didn't know how to answer that question. He'd never been in love, so he couldn't speak to that aspect of it, but he'd been that guy once. Not that he'd been a player, picking different women every weekend, but he'd slept with women he'd only marginally cared for. He'd slept with women he'd known he'd never fall in love with, never marry. In college, he'd learned the damage that kind of behavior could do to a soul. He'd repented, but he knew very well how a man could sleep with someone he didn't love. And he'd known his share of women who could do the same. He was happy to learn Josie wasn't one of those. Thomas doubted Bentley had felt much of anything for Shelley. In fact, he seemed to loathe her, and the feeling was mutual. How they'd put up with one another, he couldn't fathom. Maybe they'd kept the talking to a minimum. I shouldn't have moved in with him, Josie said. I shouldn't have been intimate with him. We're connected because of that, and now that I know he was with Shelley, it feels like the worst kind of betrayal. The fact that you feel so deeply about it, Thomas said, makes me wonder if you and Bentley are really through, or if maybe I should bow out. He almost added gracefully. But if she asked him to quit pursuing her, he'd do so kicking and screaming. There'd be nothing graceful about it. Josie shook her head. I don't love him. I don't want to be with him. I just feel like he lied to me. I'm hurt, but my heart isn't broken. And Shelley? She released another sigh. Oh, Shelley, I don't even know. Why should she be off the hook? I've known her almost all my life, but I'm not surprised by her behavior. She's always been pretty weak-willed. Gullible. I'm sure Bentley seduced her. Thomas didn't know if he agreed with Josie's opinion of Shelley. The woman was a little ditzy, but that didn't make her stupid. In fact, helping with his campaign, she'd proved herself to be insightful and talented. Maybe Josie was the smarter of the two, but that didn't make Shelley a simpleton. I'll forgive her, Josie said. It'll just take time. So thinking about what happened last night, Thomas said, do you think one of them changed sides? There's no reason to believe that. Anybody could have broken into my bedroom. True, and yet, there had been 4 people in that apartment besides Josie. As far as anybody outside knew, one of them could have been sitting with her all night. Maybe one of them should have been. Yet somebody felt confident enough to climb the trellis, take a pry bar to the window, and climb in, which led Thomas to believe that somebody had given the intruder the go-ahead. That could have been any of them, not just those who had access to her bedroom, meaning both Thomas and Bentley would be included on the list. Had Lake been keeping Donnelly informed of everybody's whereabouts in the apartment? If so, Donnelly could be on the suspect list, except Zach had confirmed that Donnelly had been at the hotel all night. Donnelly had been cleared. Thomas hadn't been in contact with anyone, but Shelley had been on her phone more than once. To whom? And Bentley. Bentley had been on his phone throughout the night. What are you thinking? Josie asked. Nothing he needed to share with her. Josie had enough worries without adding more reason for her to suspect the people she trusted to protect her. But Thomas would be giving Zach Tyler a call when he had a chance, because it was very possible one of the people closest to Josie was working against her.
Chapter 27. Josie sat across from Thomas at a little restaurant she'd never heard of. What is farm-to-table fusion? Thomas studied his menu. I think it means they can't decide what kind of restaurant they want to be. They have French food, Italian, Greek, Asian. Maybe fusion is another word for befuddled. It felt good to laugh. Smells good, at least. Donnelly stood near the door, gaze flicking around the room. The modern place, with its shiny light hardwood floors and square tables and black chairs, was mostly empty. She figured a lot of folks were preparing to watch fireworks or flipping burgers on a grill. Farm-to-table fusion wasn't exactly traditional 4th of July fare. We should ask Donnelly what he wants, Josie said. We can get it to go? Thomas popped up from the table and approached the bodyguard, menu in hand. Donnelly didn't look pleased, but after they chatted a minute, he glanced at the menu. Thomas slid back into his chair. He told me he didn't need anything and refused to choose until I threatened to order him a chickpea salad. He'll have the steak. Josie studied the menu, reminding herself that this wasn't a date, just 2 people sharing a meal, chatting, acting like all was well. Not that she wouldn't gladly go out with Thomas. In fact, she looked forward to it, but she didn't want this to count as their first date. She hoped that could happen when they didn't have a bodyguard in tow. They decided not to talk about what had happened the night before. This was to be a break from the drama, not a continuation of it. After they ordered, Thomas told her what it was like growing up in Coventry, about skiing in the winter and boating in the summer, about his parents and his siblings. His folks still lived in Coventry, but his siblings had moved away after college, 2 to southern New Hampshire, 1 to the Boston area. I see them a few times a year, Thomas said. I miss them, of course, but I don't blame them for leaving. Small-town life is great, but the employment options aren't like they are in the city. If you don't want to work in the tourism industry or at HCI, there's not a lot of opportunity here. You made a way for yourself, though, Josie said. I'm lucky. Blessed, she thought. And a hard worker. And he loved people and treated them with dignity, especially important for someone in sales. How had she ever thought him disingenuous, a typical politician? She used to trust her first impressions, but she'd been way off about Thomas. And if he was an alpha male, he was the best kind. A leader, but a sacrificial one. Meek. In modern language, meek equated to weak, but she'd heard a sermon once that delved into the origins of the word in Greek. The pastor had explained in great detail what the word would have meant to Jesus' listeners when he'd said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Josie didn't remember all of that sermon, but she remembered the phrases the pastor had used to define meekness. Strength under control, a willingness to take on others' burdens. Thomas was a beautiful image of meek, strong and eager to use his strength to bless others. An alpha male submitted to God's authority. It was beautiful. He set his drink down, head tilted to the side. What are you thinking? Warmth filled her cheeks, and she dropped her gaze. She hated to think of the adoring look she must have had on her face. Nothing, nothing. She took a bite of salad and chewed slowly, wrestling her thoughts back in line. When she did, she told him about her growing-up years. Long, humid summer days, evenings decorated with brilliant sunsets and flickering fireflies. So many afternoons sitting in the stands to watch her brother's baseball games. You didn't play? You've clearly never tossed me a ball. If you had, you'd see I don't so much catch as duck and prey. He chuckled. You get that from your mother? Dad, actually. Mom was an all-star softball player. Dad was captain of the debate team. How about you, sports? I played a few in high school, even played football in college for a couple of years. College ball? I'm impressed. Don't be. Plymouth is a D3 school. Her facial expression must have clued him in that she didn't understand because he chuckled. You went to Duke, right? That's a Division I school. We weren't in their league. How did you know I went to Duke? His smile was quick, very amused. What? You mentioned it last night, a couple of times. Her cheeks flared for the second time in a few minutes. Oh, no. What else did I say? Nothing to be embarrassed about. But the way he was still smiling told her different. What? You told us you're smart. You wanted us to explain what we were so worried about. You were sure you could help, which is why you said you went to Duke. The doctor was very impressed. She touched her cool hands to her burning cheeks. How embarrassing. Thomas was still smiling. There must be more to the story. What? He shrugged. Nothing. Not nothing. What? He leaned forward and lowered his voice. You might have suggested you and I should kiss again. Oh no, I hope I didn't say that in front of Bentley. Thomas's expression dimmed. You didn't. He speared a few bits of penny pasta. She'd definitely ruined the moment. She ate a few bites of her meal and then set her fork down. You said you played football a couple of years in college. How come you didn't play the whole time? Did you tire of it? If she'd hoped to revive Thomas's mood, she'd failed. Thomas took another bite. She could let him off the hook, but she was curious, so she kept her mouth shut. He set the fork down. It's an ugly story, one I don't like to talk about, or think about, actually. You don't have to tell me. He studied her a long moment. She wondered what he saw in her eyes. Hopefully acceptance and friendship, and maybe more. She was starting to feel the more. And it wasn't just the kiss. It was the way he'd stuck by her, despite the conflicts swirling around her. The way he'd pursued her friendship as ardently as he'd once pursued her as a date. It was his kindness and generosity. His meekness. It was everything. December, junior year, he said. I was at a frat party. Most of my teammates were there, along with what seemed like half the women on campus. I was dating this girl, Amber, and she came. We'd been out a few times, nothing serious. Except, college kids. Maybe you weren't like this. You probably weren't. He swallowed. Anyway, we'd been, I'm not sure I do. We were sleeping together. He seemed to cringe at the words, which to me felt like, no big deal. I was young and stupid, and girls seemed to like me. She could imagine Thomas as a college kid, handsome, strong, popular. Also, charming, kind, remembering everybody's name. Of course, the girls liked him. Anyway, Amber was at the party, but I was with my buddies, drinking. I wasn't paying attention to her. I sort of wanted her to leave. I guess I wasn't as into her as she was me, which makes me the biggest jerk. What were you, 20? Yeah. Josie picked at her salad until he continued the story. She asked me to take her home. She was mad that I'd been ignoring her, demanding I stop what I was doing. It was about 9:30, and I didn't want to leave. I was playing ping pong, and I was winning. The guys were razzing me about being henpecked, which ticked me off. I told her I'd take her home later, but she got huffy and stormed out. I should have gone after her. She could have waited until you were done with your game. Thomas nodded, sipped his drink. Josie had a bad feeling about where this was going. She was attacked, he said. After she left the party, a guy grabbed her, dragged her off the road into the woods, raped her. Oh my gosh, Thomas, that's awful. I'm so sorry. Didn't happen to me. She heard not defensiveness, but something else in his tone. If she had to guess, she'd name it self-loathing. I was drinking beer and having the time of my life. What happened to her wasn't your fault. She made her choices. So it was her fault? I'm not saying that. The person who attacked her, it was his fault. I'm just saying she decided to walk home alone. She didn't have to do that. Did they catch the guy? He went to prison. How about Amber? A stranger got her to the hospital and called her parents. She left school and never returned. We talked once after that. I told her how sorry I was, and she said the same thing you said, that it wasn't my fault. But I should have been there for her. After that, I had no desire to play football, or go to parties, or do any of the stuff I'd been doing. In that respect, what happened to her was good for me. I got my act together, returned to God. And Amber? Josie hoped her story ended as well. By all accounts, she recovered physically. She'd been a recreational drug user, but they prescribed her painkillers in the hospital, and she got hooked. When they proved hard to come by, she graduated to heroin. Last I heard, she'd checked herself out of rehab and relapsed. Oh, poor thing. Josie leaned toward him, wishing there weren't a table between them, wishing she could comfort him as he'd comforted her earlier. It wasn't your fault. Maybe you should have walked her home, but you didn't attack her. And you certainly didn't force her to use drugs. I know. He tipped up the corners of his mouth, as if trying to force a smile, but the rest of his face wasn't on board. Why was the world such a horrible place? What kind of men lurked behind bushes and attacked defenseless women? What kind of people slipped drugs into women's drinks? What kind of people made their living killing unborn babies? She knew there was a God, and knew that he didn't condone any of that. He sent people like Josie's father, like Thomas, to fight evil. Her gaze snapped up. That's why you're so protective. One of his shoulders lifted, dropped. I just think, I know I wasn't the person who attacked her, but I could have prevented it. I could have been there. So now, I guess I just always want to be there. I never want to be the guy who's sitting at home drinking a beer while somebody's trapped in a burning building or suffering a heart attack. Or stranded on a mountain with a broken ankle. A glimmer lit his eyes. That worked out well for me. Me too. I'd still be sitting there if not for you. Beta would have gotten you out of there somehow. She gave him a look intended to convey disapproval, and he chuckled. You asked me to stop calling him that, and I did. To his face. Very big of you. I'm nothing if not kind. He regarded her across the table for a long moment, and she felt a connection between them, a stirring deep in her soul. There was something here with this man. There was something new and different, something she'd never felt before. She couldn't define it, not yet. But maybe, with time. So, he said, now I've told you my big, bad secret. What's yours? Everything she'd been feeling twisted inside her, along with the salad. What was she thinking? He was only attracted to her because he didn't know the truth about her. When he did, I'm guessing it has something to do with Mitchell, right? She looked around at the restaurant. Not that there were many diners there, but some people had better hearing than others. Shelley'd taught her that. She didn't want to tell Thomas. She didn't want to tell anybody. But Thomas had confided in her, and he'd proved his devotion over and over. And by staying by her side, he'd likely made himself a target. Yes, if anybody deserved to know the truth, it was Thomas. Maybe after he knew everything, he'd distance himself from her. Because Josie could only bring trouble into his life. She had very little else to offer. Josie hadn't told Thomas her story in the restaurant, and, seated in the back seat of Donley's SUV, she didn't want to share it. Donley could be trusted not to tell anybody her secret. Probably. But Josie didn't trust anybody except Thomas at the moment. She'd tell him her story later, when they were alone. And maybe she was full of excuses. Who could blame her for wanting to hide the worst thing about herself from this good and kind man? The scent of Donley's takeout filtered back from the front seat, making her wish she'd eaten more of her salad, or at least a few bites of the cheesecake Thomas had ordered for them to share. As they wound along back roads toward Coventry, fatigue was pressing in. Thomas slid his arm around her shoulder and urged her closer. She settled her head against his chest and closed her eyes, drifting off. The shrill sound of her phone ringing jarred her from sleep. She pulled it from her purse and glanced at the screen. Dad. Thomas shifted away and pulled his arm back. You'd better get that. She was surprised her father had left her alone for a couple of hours. She'd been talking to him off and on all day. Steeling herself, she connected the video call. Hey, Dad. His face filled the screen. Where are you? On our way back from dinner. He didn't have to speak his disapproval. It was written on his features. Someone almost killed you last night. I know, but... Your bodyguards shouldn't have let you... They don't tell me what to do, Josie said. Did you need something? Mom leaned into view. We're worried about you, sweetheart. I'm being careful, Mom. Nobody knew where we were going. Who's we? Dad asked. She angled the phone to Thomas, who said, Senator, Mrs. Harrington. Thomas hadn't spoken to Josie's mother yet. Mom's eyes brightened. You must be Thomas. It's nice to meet you. You too, ma'am. She smiled. Look at that. A Yankee with manners. I didn't think they existed. Thomas laughed. We're a rare breed. Before Mom could respond, Dad said, Josephine, you need to come home where you'll be safe. I've gotten you a flight out of Manchester tomorrow at... I hope it's refundable, Josie said. I'm not leaving. Josephine Maria Harrington, her father said. This is no longer negotiable. Your mother is worried sick. Mom nodded, all amusement fading away. We're both worried. Won't you just come home for a visit until we can get this sorted out? I own a business here, Josie said. It's bad enough I've been AWOL all day. I can't leave my employees to manage the place while I'm gone. Then hire better employees, Dad snapped. If you lose the business, you can start another. Easy for you to say. She took a breath and infused calm into her voice. I've built a life here, Dad. This is my home. It would be temporary, Mom said. Your safety is more important than your business. She glanced at Thomas, whose lips were pressed in a grim line. He said, Marcel and Kinsey could keep the business running. Two? Your safety is... Listen to the man, Dad said. Then, hold on. The screen went black a moment before Carlyle's face popped up. Hey, Josie! She suppressed a sigh. Carlyle, are you here to bully me too? Was that on the agenda? The older man asked. I'm not prepared, but I can get caught up. She scowled at him, and he grinned. Dad was not amused. We're explaining why she needs to come home. And? Carlyle asked. Are you going to? No, she said. Definitely, Dad said. Precious girl, Mom said. It would be so nice to have you home. Donley pulled the car into the driveway beside Josie's house and turned to her, a no-nonsense expression on his face. We need to get you inside. She'd never liked the bodyguard more. Sorry, y'all, but I have to go. Before they could argue, she ended the video chat and rounded on Thomas. Thanks for backing me up. His eyes widened. Before he could come up with a response, Donley opened her door, and she climbed out and stomped up the exterior staircase. She stepped inside her apartment, and Thomas and Donley followed. Donley locked the door, and she and Thomas stood against the wall, silent, while the bodyguard searched the apartment. A moment later, he returned from down the hall. It's clear. Josie crossed the room and collapsed on the sofa. Though Thomas wasn't her boyfriend, she could imagine it. She liked the idea of it, but if he didn't back her up on the important things. I just want you to be safe. He settled beside her on the couch. You'd be safe there. Would I? Or would I just put my mother in danger? Isn't she already in danger? Josie shrugged. My brother and his family haven't been targeted. Mom hasn't been targeted. Any chance that's because they have better protection? Thomas's gaze flicked to Donley. No offense. You could be better protected, Donley said. I can call my agency tonight. Get more guys up here. Assuming she could trust them, she shifted to face the man by the door. Did you get an update on Lake? His eyes didn't react to the question, but his lips hardened. She's been taken off the case. The agency's sending someone else. Someone you trust? He dipped his head. You thought Lake was trustworthy. Lake is trustworthy. Donley's tone dared her to argue. I don't know what they found, if they found anything, or if they're just being extra cautious, but I'd trust Lake with my life. Can you call and ask her what happened? Josie asked. I've been told to have no contact with her. Can I call her? The bodyguard regarded Josie a long moment. She didn't know what she hoped to learn from Lake, but she'd trusted the woman. She didn't want to believe Lake had betrayed her. Maybe if she understood. Donley yanked his phone from his pocket and, stepping closer, tapped the screen. He held it so Josie could see the number there. Josie dialed her own phone, putting it on speaker. It rang 4 times, and she was preparing to leave a message when it connected. This is Lake. Did the woman ever use her first name? Come to think of it, Josie didn't even know her first name. It's Josie. How are you? There was a long pause before Lake said, Fine. Are you safe? Yeah. She waited a beat, hoped Lake would say something else, but the woman didn't. What happened? A sizable deposit was made into my bank account yesterday. Thomas shifted closer. Sizable like? $50,000, Lake said. I have no idea where it came from. How was the deposit made? Thomas asked. In person, online, or by mail? I didn't know you could make deposits by mail, Josie said. Is that how you usually deposit your checks? It's the 21st century, ma'am. I have an app for that. I've never mailed a check, but the bank didn't think to flag it as unusual. They don't question deposits like they do withdrawals. The authorities are investigating the origin of the check. Do you know what they've learned so far? Josie asked. They're not in the mood to share. For the first time, Lake's voice held a tinge of bitterness. I knew nothing about that deposit until the chief there in Coventry. Coate? Thomas said. Until Coate told me about it. I was not working against you. Donley stood by the door. A glance at his face told Josie he was satisfied with his partner's answer. She wasn't so sure. She'd known people to do things they'd never otherwise consider for less money than $50,000. Thomas said, Do you have any theories, Lake? The question was met with silence that stretched for 10 seconds. 20, 30. Then Lake said, "Mrs. Smith? I'm here. Donley's on your side. I'm on your side. Your family's on your side. I wouldn't trust anybody else." Josie turned to Thomas, who glared at the phone. "Thomas was nowhere near my room last night. I'm not saying he has anything to do with this. I'm saying you were smart to send your other friends away. Maybe you're right to trust Thomas. Maybe you're not. I don't know. I do know this is bigger than we first understood. Whoever's behind this, they're not playing games. You're not safe." The words made Josie's heart jolt. She breathed through the fear. "Okay. Thanks for talking to me. I'm sure they'll get to the bottom of this, and you'll be cleared." "Thank you, ma'am." 3 beeps told her Lake had disconnected. The momentary relief Josie had enjoyed during dinner was long gone. She turned to Donley. "This new agent, you trust him?" "It's a woman, and I don't work with people I don't trust. But 2 people can't protect you like a team can. If I were you, I'd either hire more protection or do what your father suggests, assuming he and your mother have better protection than you do." The problem was, Donley and Thomas, and her father for that matter, didn't know what Josie knew, that Mitchell had reason to target her, that if she went home, she might be safer, or she might be putting her family in more danger. Staying here, though, she was likely putting Thomas in danger. Maybe a team of bodyguards wasn't a bad idea. It was better than the alternatives. Her phone rang. She'd sort of hoped they'd take her not having called back as a hint, not that her father had ever been great at taking hints. She connected the video call and angled the phone so Thomas was on the screen. Carlisle's image popped up first, her dad's a moment later. Both the images were tiny on her phone. "If you're not going to come home," Carlisle said, "then we need to consider our options." "There are no options," Dad said. "I'm not voting for the bill." Josie had known Carlisle for as long as she could remember. She'd worked with him for years. So when he shifted, when his cheeks puffed out, she knew he had something important to say. Something he didn't think her father would want to hear. Dad knew it too. "Spit it out, Carlisle." "Talk to Parker," Carlisle said. "She said they'd be willing to make changes." "We've been down this road." Dad's voice held a level of frustration he rarely allowed voters to hear. "They've put more on the table," Carlisle said. "They're willing to cut the overall cost by half. That's a heck of a concession." Her father glared at the screen, but she knew the anger wasn't directed at her. "Are they still going to fund new clinics?" For his part, Carlisle didn't squirm, just looked dead into the camera. "They won't budge on that." Dad crossed his arms. "I won't either." Carlisle sat behind his desk in his office, despite the fact that it was nearly 10 p.m. "You'd put your daughter in danger?" Dad ran a hand through his hair. A single word escaped his mouth, filled with anguish. "Josie!" She wanted to tell him not to worry about her, that she'd be fine. But these people, whoever they were, had gotten to her not once, not twice, but 3 times. They'd threatened her. They'd drugged her. They'd broken into her bedroom. And that wasn't even counting the time they'd had her arrested. How far would Mitchell go to get what he wanted? As far as she and Bentley had gone to get what they'd wanted? Maybe just a little bit farther. Maybe a lot farther. "Sir?" Carlisle and Dad had been friends for years. Carlisle rarely called him sir. Her father lifted his hand in a let-me-think motion. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Dad said, "Josie, please, darlin', please come home." She didn't want to, but this wasn't about her. It was much, much bigger than one small-town coffee shop owner. Her employees could keep Cup of Josies open. She could hire more staff if need be. Not that the business was raking in the cash, but she had money. Thomas took her hand and squeezed. His voice was low when he said, "It wouldn't be forever." When she looked his way, his expression was pleading. He didn't want her to leave. She knew that. But he did want her to be safe. "Okay, tomorrow I'll talk to my employees. I'm not willing to lose my business over this." Dad's shoulders relaxed. "You just tell us how we can help." "In the meantime," Carlisle said, "you need to keep me informed about where you go and what you do. I need to know what's going on up there, who you're spending time with, that sort of thing. I have a bodyguard, Carlyle. I don't need a keeper. He leaned toward the camera. Look, I know you're mad at Bentley right now. Mad wasn't the right word. But he was my eyes and ears there, Carlyle said. Now that he's gone, I feel like I'm flying blind. There's nothing going on here you need to know about, Josie said. He stared into the camera. You're wrong. I need to know everything. Where you go, what you do, who you talk to. The more I know, the better shot we have of getting to the bottom of this. You and I both know what this is about. The words hung between them. So Carlyle knew. The realization churned her stomach. What does that mean? Dad asked. Thomas gave her a curious look, but said nothing. Carlyle ignored the other two men. I expect you to keep me in the loop. Dad's eyes flicked back and forth, studying them both. But neither of them would tell Dad what Carlyle was talking about. And fortunately, Dad had been in politics long enough to know when he ought not to press it. Finally, Josie nodded. Will do. Better yet, Carlyle said. Give your bodyguard the go-ahead to alert me about your plans, and you won't have to worry about it. She glanced at Donley, expecting him to nod or give her a gesture of approval. But he didn't. He shook his head. What did that mean? Rather than get into it, she focused back on the screen. I'll keep you informed. Before either man could speak again, she ended the call. She'd been tired before the conversation. Now she felt wrung out. She turned back to Donley. Do you not trust Carlyle? His gaze flicked from her to Thomas and back. Bentley was keeping Carlyle informed last night. I don't know what he told him. I do know somebody felt pretty confident climbing in your window. So, no, I don't trust anybody right now, not even the man who hired me.
Chapter 28. It was just after 10 o'clock when Josie said goodnight. Thomas watched as she padded in bare feet down the hall to her bedroom. How she thought she'd be able to sleep with the fireworks going off at the park just a few blocks away, Thomas had no idea. After she disappeared into her room, Thomas stretched out on the sofa. I know you're not thrilled I'm here. Earlier, when the cops were still there, Donley had wedged a 2x4 on top of the double-hung window in Josie's room to ensure nobody would be able to break in again. Still, he'd asked her to keep her door open and warned her he'd be popping his head in occasionally to ensure she was safe. Josie hadn't argued, though she'd looked so tired. Thomas thought maybe she hadn't had the energy to care. Now Donley leveled his gaze at Thomas. Can I look at your phone? Come again? All the rest of us, myself, Lake, Bentley, Shelley, had our phones checked, but you didn't. Thomas crossed to where his phone was plugged in, disconnected it, and handed it to the bodyguard. Donley lifted it to Thomas's face and the phone unlocked. Then the man tapped the screen. Thomas had nothing to hide, so he returned to the couch. After dinner, he had run home to change and brush his teeth. He was struggling to keep his eyes open. He wasn't sure how Donley was holding up. When will your partner be here? Thomas asked. Couple hours. She was on another assignment. Donley barely glanced up from his perusal. When she gets here, I'll head back to the hotel and rest. He lowered the phone. No calls or texts from the time we left the hospital last night until this morning. I know. Unless you deleted them. Lake was here. You can ask her. I got my charger from my apartment, plugged it in right there. He nodded to the TV console, and never touched it again. Donley returned it to the charger. I had to make sure. Somebody alerted the intruder that it was safe to break in. Possibly. You don't think it was Lake? Assuming that's what happened, I know it wasn't Lake. Was she on her phone? Thomas thought back. He'd never seen either bodyguard look at a cell phone while on duty except to talk to one another. But she always had that earpiece in her ear. Somebody could have called her. Maybe there'd been some super secret signal through her earpiece. At this point, anything was possible. If you're right, Thomas said, then that leaves Bentley and Shelley. Both of whom were questioned and released, Donley said. But that doesn't mean they're innocent. It just means they weren't caught. Or maybe the intruder just took a chance she'd be alone. Also possible. Donley stared ahead, but his eyes narrowed. He shook his head. This guy has managed to avoid getting caught. Would he take the chance last night? Unless I can see somebody well-trained. He might try to see if anybody was awake in the room. How? Toss pebbles against the glass. Get somebody to glance out. If he was really good, he could climb the trellis without being heard and peek inside. Her curtains have gaps. Maybe nobody alerted the intruder, Thomas clarified. Maybe. So we've got nothing. Donnelly's frown reflected Thomas's frustration. It's good she's going to her parents' house. This place isn't secure at all. I assume she'll be safer there. Thomas was about to agree when he remembered something Donnelly had said earlier. You don't trust Carlyle? I don't trust anybody. Carlyle had seemed to be trying to convince the senator to vote for the bill, and according to Bentley, he'd been on board with that plan since the weekend Josie was arrested. Did that mean he was working for Mitchell? Or was this typical politics? Fight for what you believe in until it gets hard and then give in? Thomas hoped that, when his own back was against the wall, he'd stand strong like the senator was doing. He hoped he'd be able to place the people he loved in God's capable hands. Right, because he'd done such a good job of that. Since Amber's attack, he'd struggled to trust God with other people's safety. His own life, no problem. But with anyone else? That was one reason Thomas so often stepped into the role of protector. God hadn't looked after Amber. How could Thomas trust him to protect Josie or anybody else? That was why he was running for mayor. Maybe somebody else would have stepped up to protect Coventry from Farley, but Thomas hadn't been willing to risk the people he loved on a maybe. He needed to learn to trust God in that area, but it wasn't going to happen tonight. And what about you? Thomas asked. When she leaves, will you get another assignment right away? Probably. Is this one typical? The man almost cracked a smile. Most of our clients are rich, often famous, and either paranoid that somebody's after them or trying to make themselves seem more important than they are. So the opposite of Josie. Yeah, this must be a nice change of pace. The bodyguard scowled. There's nothing good about it, and the fact that we've failed to keep her safe doesn't sit well. We need more resources, more information, or just to get her to her parents' house. Then you'll be off the hook. And Thomas would be alone with all the time in the world to devote to his campaign. That should feel like a good thing, but it didn't. Thomas settled back on the sofa, yawning. He was just drifting off, despite the fireworks booming outside, when his phone rang. Should he ignore it? All things considered, probably not. But when he crossed the room to glance at the screen, he almost rejected the call. What do you want? Bentley said, I need to talk to Josie. You have her number. She didn't pick up, but this is important. I don't know what to tell you, man. You're still there, right? Is she... Bentley swallowed audibly. Right there with you? It's okay. I mean, she and I... She's in her room. I'm on the couch. Not that it's any of your business. Thomas didn't want anybody, including Bentley, getting the wrong idea. Okay. Bentley's tone was considerably brighter. Good. Anyway, I need to talk to her. Obviously, she doesn't need to talk to you. Why don't you tell me what you need, and I'll pass the message along. We don't need a go-between. Do you want my help or not? I'm not working against her. I would never hurt her. Or her father, for that matter. The man means everything to me. She means everything to me. Bentley sounded sincere. Thomas took a chance and asked, Where'd the money come from? My great-aunt. I don't have the will, but when her lawyer's office opens tomorrow, I'll have a copy sent over to whoever wants to see it. She had a lot more money than anyone in the family knew. I get that it looks bad, but I haven't done anything wrong. Maybe, but Bentley had urged the senator to vote yes on the bill. Did that mean he was working for Mitchell? Or did it mean his care for Josie overrode his convictions? Assuming he had convictions. Maybe that's true, Thomas said, but it doesn't change anything. You could put in a good word for me. Thomas didn't bother to respond to that. She doesn't belong here, Bentley said. She'll never be happy here. It's possible she knows herself better than you know her. Maybe she does, but one thing's for sure, I know her better than you do. Not for long, not if Thomas had anything to say about it, but he wasn't the type of guy to pour salt into wounds. You said you had something important? I've been working on finding a way to get Mitchell to back off. Rumor has it he's involved with another mistress, this one older than the last and well-connected. Unfortunately, that angle probably won't work because Mitchell's at his summer home with his family, so we won't be able to catch him with this woman anytime soon. I have people trying to hack his phone, but I don't want to know this, Bentley, and I'm sure Josie doesn't either. Bentley's laugh was short and humorless, proving what I said earlier, that I know her better than you do. Surely Josie wouldn't condone such behavior, right? Until we get something solid, Bentley said, I've started rumors in his organization to try to get a little Me Too action going. The rumors are vague. I'm just trying to get someone to go on the record. Someone not afraid of backlash. Though that still didn't sit well. If Mitchell was the pervert a few of his female employees suggested he was, he needed to be removed from a position of authority, possibly prosecuted. How will that help? If Mitchell thinks we can keep the truth about himself and his behavior from coming out, he'll back off. So what will that look like? A woman gets the courage to come forward with allegations, and then Mitchell leaves Josie alone. And then what? You shut that woman up? We incentivize her to keep quiet. And all the other women, assuming there are others, and you haven't just made that whole angle up, are taught that coming forward ends with, what? What would happen to the one who came forward? She'd get fired, probably. She'd be publicly humiliated. We can't save the world here, Thomas. We're trying to protect Josie. By putting other people in harm's way. Not harm, just because a man who almost killed Josie wouldn't harm a woman who spoke out against him. You're getting way ahead of yourself. No, I'm taking your actions to their logical conclusions. Do you ever do that? Or do you just run ahead, full bore? I'm a strategist, Thomas. This is what I do. And yes, I know the consequences. I also know that the senator won't vote yes. I'm trying to protect him, my boss, and Josie, the woman I love. That line hit its mark. Thomas cared about Josie too. Was it love? Maybe not yet, but it could be. Still, he wasn't willing to destroy other vulnerable women to protect her. Arguing this point with Bentley felt fruitless. What if Mitchell doesn't capitulate? Then we bring him down, hard. We destroy him, destroy his reputation, so that even if the senator votes for the bill, Mitchell doesn't profit. But he still will. He owns all that property. He owns the abortion mills. Maybe he'll back out of the public eye, but we can't exactly force him to sell his clinics. Fine, but he's a public figure. Bentley's tone was that of a patient teacher speaking to a dull-headed student. Famous people want to be loved. He'll do anything to keep the truth from coming out. So you're planning to destroy him to punish him? Not to stop him, but to, what? Make yourself feel better, knowing you got the last word? You have a problem with that? Don't you want him to pay? Not like this. If he's behind what happened to her, then we should prove it. We should bring what he's done to light. We should have him arrested, have charges. That's not how the game is played. There's no way he'll ever face criminal charges. Was that true? Could Mitchell truly threaten a woman, drug her, nearly kill her, and get away with it? Or was this all really just a game to Bentley and people like him, a game they preferred to play outside the boundaries of the law? Look, man, I get it, Bentley said. This is too much for your small-town mind to comprehend. If by small town you mean honest, forthright, and above board, then yeah, I guess it is too much for me. Which is irrelevant. I'm just asking you to tell Josie what I told you. Tell her I'm working on a solution. If she goes home and stays out of the public eye, stays safe for a couple of weeks, I can bring him down. Outside, the booms of fireworks became more frequent. Maybe they were getting to the finale. Maybe once the boom stopped, Thomas would be able to rest. But in life, unlike in fireworks, the most damaging attacks didn't come with booms. They came with drugs being slipped into drinks, intruders creeping through windows, powerful people pulling strings, bringing down enemies and damaging the innocent along the way. You'll pass the message along? Bentley asked. She's sleeping. Maybe she'll rest easier knowing I have a plan. Thomas hoped not. Bentley scheming, trying to expose Mitchell's mistress, paying to hack a phone, spreading false rumors in hopes of bringing out some version of the truth, no matter who got hurt, should not lead to improved sleep. I'll tell her when I tell her, Beta. "What is with that name?" Finally, the man had asked. Thomas had waited for this moment, the opportunity to explain the difference between being the alpha and being the beta. But he didn't have it in him. "It's too much for your big city mind to comprehend." He ended the call and plugged his phone in again, silencing it before padding back to the sofa. Donnelly gave him a long, hard look, but Thomas wasn't about to recap the conversation. The bodyguard had overheard enough. Thomas closed his eyes and put the conversation with Bentley out of his head. Instead, he thought about something Donnelly had said. There was nothing good about Josie's life being in danger, except that the situation had given Thomas the opportunity to get to know her. He'd been attracted to her from the first time he'd seen her. That attraction had grown to something else, something much stronger. Because of that, he'd be grateful for this difficult situation, as long as Josie came through it unscathed. He prayed when this was all over, when she returned to Coventry and picked up her life again, she'd still want Thomas to be a part of it. But she had a secret, a big one she hadn't wanted to share at the restaurant. One that he was beginning to believe involved Bentley and the kinds of tactics the man had seemed so proud of. A secret she hadn't shared with Thomas. Thomas was up and down all night, replaying that conversation with Bentley and worrying about Josie. More than once, he wandered toward her bedroom and peeked inside, always to find her sound asleep and safe. He'd been aware when Donnelly's replacement had arrived but hadn't opened his eyes. He had plenty of time to meet her later. Even when he'd slept, his mind had been churning with all he'd learned. It wasn't exactly a restful night. He awoke to Josie's voice. "Dad, calm down." Thomas opened his eyes. Light was peeking through the curtains, though not very much. It was either very early or very cloudy outside. He sat up as Josie entered the living room, hair messy from sleep. She wore blue cotton pajamas and walked on bare feet. As adorable as the picture was, her expression told him something was wrong. He stood and stretched. Josie stared at him, eyes widening, speaking into the phone pressed to her ear. "What pictures?" She settled in a chair at the table, pulled her laptop from its bag, and opened it up. Thomas sat beside her, not sure what was going on or what to do. He got a glimpse of the clock in the kitchen. It was just after 5 in the morning. Josie set the phone on the table and hit the speaker button. She lifted her finger to her lips, telling Thomas to keep quiet. Senator Harrington's voice came through loud and clear. "Gonna have that man drawn and quartered, and don't think I won't do it. It's one thing you living with Bentley. I didn't like it, but..." "Dad, it's not what?" "But this is unacceptable. I don't even know this fellow. Here he's acting like he's trying to protect you, and all the while..." "Stop, or I'm hanging up." Silence. "Just let me catch up with you, okay?" Josie asked. "I'm waiting." Thomas mouthed, "What happened?" She shook her head and clicked on her laptop screen. Her eyes widened. A flush crept up her neck and into her cheeks, and she dropped her face into her hands. Thomas angled the laptop toward himself, and the bottom dropped out of his stomach. It was a photograph. Josie lying on her stomach, her head to the side, her face pressed against the pillow, her eyes closed. A sheet covered her bottom half. Her top half was bare. No pajamas, no bra, just skin. On the far side of the bed, a man was standing over her. Thomas looked at the man's face. It was his own. He was wearing nothing but a towel. Looking down at her, he stared at the photo, but he couldn't make sense of it. He'd never been in Josie's room. Never. Certainly never in a towel. Never when she was in bed, unclothed. Josie met his eyes. She mouthed, "I'm so sorry." He opened his mouth, but her quick head shake silenced him. "You up to speed now, darling?" the man asked. "It's not real, Dad. It has to be photoshopped. Or maybe your Thomas isn't the hero he pretends to be." Thomas wanted to speak, to defend himself. Why were they pretending he wasn't there? They'd done nothing wrong. "It has to be photoshopped, Dad. Thomas and I are just friends." "Is that so?" The man's voice held more than a hint of doubt. "I can date anyone I choose. Why would I lie?" "I just sent you another photo," the senator said. "I'll wait." Josie angled the laptop back to herself and clicked a few times. Then her eyes closed. Again, Thomas shifted the screen. He scrolled down to see there were 10 photos. They captured Thomas and Josie's kiss from the first fervent moments to when he'd backed her against the stage wall to when they'd ended the kiss and embraced. His body remembered that moment and longed to revisit it, but his mind registered the awful truth. Somebody had been watching. Josie took a deep breath and opened her eyes. She avoided looking in Thomas's direction. "Dad, I need you to listen to me. Thomas and I kissed just one time after his speech at the fundraiser. Is there an attraction between us?" "Definitely. Is it more than that?" "Certainly not." "Wow." Jab a little knife in his back to go along with the nausea and crumbling dreams. "The photos of us kissing are real," she said. "The photos of us in my bedroom are photoshopped. That kiss, that's as close as Thomas and I have gotten to the bedroom. And this paragon of goodness just waltzes around in a towel?" The senator scoffed into the phone. "Or unless, if the threats are real." "What threats?" Josie looked at Thomas to explain the image. He lifted imaginary barbells. "They were probably taken at the gym," she said. He grabbed her laptop, opened a note, and typed SAR, Fire Department, Paramedic. "And he's a volunteer with Search and Rescue. Remember how I told you he was the one who carried me off the mountain?" "Mm-hmm." The senator didn't sound impressed. "He also volunteers with the fire department and the local ambulance service. I'm guessing all of those places have showers and locker rooms. Lots of opportunities for someone to take his photo without his knowledge. And then they plopped his image into the picture of me, making it look like he was there. But Dad, he wasn't. It's not real." "If that's the case," the senator said, "someone did a heck of a job faking it. Get Carlisle on it. He can find someone to prove." "You think I want to show this to Carlisle? It's not fittin'." The man's southern accent was more pronounced than Thomas had ever heard it. Josie said, "I know, but..." "And for all we know, Thomas set the whole thing up. Maybe you were sleeping, and he let himself into your room. It could have happened weeks ago. Maybe." "That's not what happened. Listen to me." "So you can defend him?" "He doesn't need me to defend him. He hasn't done anything wrong." Josie shot Thomas a tortured look. "That photo had to have been taken the night before last, when I was drugged." "You don't know that." "I do, because I sleep in pajamas. Every single night. You woke me from a dead sleep this morning. Shall I take a selfie so you can see what I wore to bed? They're blue and they have little yellow flowers on them." The senator was quiet for a long moment. "Okay, you sleep in pajamas." "Which means the intruder did more than just relate that message to me the other night." She swallowed and horror filled her features. "He took these pictures when I was drugged." "You weren't in pajamas because I was so out of it from the drug that it was all Shelley could do to get my dress off. We thought, you and Bentley and I all thought they slipped me the drugs to make me look bad. We thought they broke into my apartment to prove they could get to me. But this was their real objective." Her gaze snapped to Thomas, and her mouth opened in a little O. But Thomas had already put it together. This was what the reporter's phone call had been about. Either she'd already had these photos, or she'd been told they were forthcoming. While Josie and her father discussed the many terrible possibilities, Thomas crossed the room and grabbed his phone, barely registering the bodyguard standing against the wall. He unlocked it and maneuvered to the local paper's website. No photos. Nothing about him. Huh. He settled beside Josie and showed her the paper's home screen. She nodded. "Dad, have any of them been released?" "They scheduled the vote for later today. If I vote yes, the photos will be destroyed. If I don't, these and others that are much more graphic will be released all over the country." "They can't be more graphic," Josie said. "Not unless they Photoshop our faces on other people's bodies. They might have more revealing photos of me." A flush filled her expression, but her words remained calm. "But there won't be any with me and Thomas. It's not possible." "With today's technology," the senator said, "anything is possible." The senator was right. Who knew what other evil deeds these people had up their sleeves? "Dad, get Carlisle on it. Have him get in touch with Shelley. She works with professional photographers all the time. She'll know who to call. Meanwhile, I need to contact Thomas." "You need to keep your distance from that man." "Dad," Josie gave Thomas an apologetic look. "He's just as much a victim as I am. Remember, he's running for mayor. He's got a reputation in this town. A very good reputation. This could ruin his candidacy." "Right." The senator sounded slightly less angry when he added, "I see what you mean. Not only that, but he owns an insurance agency. If this gets out, it could ruin him. The senator sighed, long and resigned. These people have gone too far. I don't have the stomach to see you hurt by them anymore. I'm just going to... Don't make any decisions. Call Carlisle. I'll talk to Thomas and get back to you. Isn't Shelley there? Talk to her in person. The fewer people who see this, I would prefer if the request came from Carlisle. The senator's words shifted from angry to concern. What's going on, darling? Did you and she have a falling out? It has nothing to do with this. So you sent her away like you sent away Bentley? Bentley. The man was like toe fungus. Would they ever be rid of him? The conversation from the night before came back to him. While Bentley was spreading rumors at Mitchell's company, Mitchell was altering photographs. They were all playing ugly games. Mitchell was just better at it. Josie said, I had a falling out. We trust Bentley to keep an eye on you, Senator Harrington said. Shelley and Bentley are your friends. I know the police up there questioned them, and they were both cleared. Did they question Thomas? They did, and he was... Doesn't matter. He probably shoots pool with the chief. You don't understand how small towns work. Can you really trust the authorities in Coventry? Thomas pushed back from the table and stood. This was beyond frustrating, not being able to speak. She met his eyes. I trust Thomas. More than you trust your oldest friend in the world? The senator asked. And the man you almost married? As a matter of... If that Thomas fellow is trying to separate you from people you know you can trust, then he might be the problem. Thomas had nothing to do with my decision to send Bentley and Shelley away. If you knew why I did it, you'd understand. That statement was met with a long silence. Then the senator said, So you found out about them. You knew. Her voice was too loud in the small room. You knew they were together? I heard a rumor. I didn't know for sure. And anyway, that was between them. You were out of the picture. Josie propped an elbow on the table and massaged her temples. Okay, fine. It doesn't matter now. You're going to have to let it go, her father said. Bentley's still there, and we trust him. He'll stay close by until you're safely home. I expect you on a flight today. But if they've scheduled the vote for this afternoon, no matter what happens today, your mom and I need to put eyes on you, all right? Thomas nodded, encouraging her to agree. He hoped it would all be over today, and maybe it would, but maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it was all about to get a whole lot worse. If those pictures were released, would Josie ever want to return to Coventry? Or would whatever this was between them be crushed under the weight of rumors and ruined reputations? Josie, darling, Senator Harrington said, I went a little crazy, thinking about somebody hurting you, taking advantage. Maybe I shouldn't have. He seemed flustered. I worry, and... For the first time since Thomas had woken up, he saw the slightest smile on Josie's lips. I love you too, Dad, and I understand. But Thomas is my friend, and I trust him. If you trust me, I understand. I'll try. She ended the call and collapsed against the chair back. It took a long moment before she met Thomas's eyes. I'm so sorry. You didn't do this. I know, but if those pictures get out, this is all my fault. You're less to blame for this than I was to blame for what happened to Amber. You weren't at all to blame for that, so... She nodded slowly. Okay, you're right. I am ticked, though. You have every right to be. This could ruin... That, too. He tried to temper his frustration, but it carried in his words. What you and I have is certainly not more than attraction. Maybe on your part, but on my part, it seemed more expedient to downplay this, she gestured between them, than to tell him everything. And expediency is more important than honesty? Or are you employing expediency now to avoid telling me the truth? She sat forward. What are you asking? You either lied to your father or you're lying to me. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell him the truth, which is the same thing. Or do you have a different definition? Are you seriously angry with me? Rather than retort, he took a breath. How did he feel? Shocked, exposed. But the cause of those couldn't be laid at Josie's feet. He also felt hurt, which could. You didn't tell him I was here. Why the secrecy? Why does it matter so much? Because I don't lie to people I love. She stood and stepped into the kitchen. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell him everything. That's where you draw the line? Because from where I'm sitting, what? She returned to the doorway facing him. From where you're sitting, what? Maybe you don't think I'm good enough for you. Or maybe you believe he'll think I'm not good enough for you. Maybe you're embarrassed to tell him you're falling for a small-town insurance agent. Why would you even suggest something like that? Have I ever given you that impression? Besides the 20 times I asked you out and you turned me down? I didn't know you then. What you knew about me didn't impress you enough to take a chance on me. I'm just saying, maybe you did tell him the truth. He stood. Maybe he should walk away. Maybe he should give her space to think. Instead, he approached her, half expecting her to back up. The new bodyguard inched closer as if to step between them if necessary, but Thomas ignored her. Josie held her ground. Maybe this thing between us is all in my head. He stopped inches away from her. Is it? Because you don't owe me anything. If you didn't tell your father about us because I'm imagining the U.S., then that's fine. But you need to tell me because maybe we're just friends who kissed that one time. He hoped, prayed, that wasn't how she felt. But he needed to know. He stepped closer, wanting more than anything to wrap his arms around her. But her flimsy pajamas had him keeping his hands to himself. Friends who kissed. Maybe that's all we'll ever be. But I need to know, because I'm already in a lot deeper than that. He angled nearer, setting himself up for another rejection. This would be the last one. If she backed away, he'd leave. He'd keep protecting her as best he could, but he'd do it from a distance. Somehow, she licked her lips. Was that an invitation? He held still, a breath away, inviting her into the space between them, but not taking anything for granted. She rose to her tiptoes and pressed her lips against his. Fireworks all over again, only these booms were much more powerful than the ones in the park the night before. He pulled her close and deepened the kiss, wrapping her in his arms. He could feel the warmth of her body through the thin fabric. All the emotions he'd endured in the 10 minutes since he'd been pulled from sleep mixed and shifted into one strong feeling of desire. He dug his fingers into her long hair, relishing the silkiness, loving the feel of her in his arms, wishing they were alone. It was good thing they weren't. He ended the kiss and took a sizable step back, breathing heavily. Her smile, when it came, seemed shy. I was just trying to get through the conversation with Dad as fast as I could. That's all. In case you haven't figured it out, there is certainly more between you and me than simple attraction. I just know my father, and I didn't want him to get sidetracked, okay? He paced to the sofa and gripped the back of it, trying to bring his rogue thoughts in line. He wasn't imagining her feelings. She cared for him, and he cared for her. You and I haven't done anything to be ashamed of. She spoke to his back. If you want me to tell him you were here last night, or that you and I are, whatever we are, then I'll tell him. But right now, we have more important things to worry about, because if Dad doesn't vote for the bill, those photos are going to be released. Right. He turned and leaned against the couch. Josie crossed the room and took his hand. You have a decision to make, Thomas. Me? Dad will do whatever I ask him to do. If I ask him to vote for the bill in order to protect my privacy and your candidacy, he will. I won't be the reason. Think it through. Pray about it. I know you want to do the noble thing here, but wanting to run your town well, to fight corruption, is also noble. Keeping those pictures out of the press. I'd do anything to protect you from that, he said. One delicate eyebrow quirked. Anything. She made a good point, because he could protect her. But at what cost? She squeezed his hand. Dad wants to protect me too. But is it the right thing? Her shoulders lifted, dropped. There are no easy answers. While Josie started a pot of coffee, Thomas tried to figure a way out of this mess. Even if they could prove the photo was doctored, photos if the threat of others was real, that would take time. Once the pictures were released, the damage would be done. Would it destroy his candidacy? Coventry was a pretty conservative town, and Thomas's voters were the most conservative of the lot. Many of them were older, most churchgoers. Sure, some people wouldn't be shocked to learn their local insurance agent wasn't as pure as the driven snow, but to see images of it? Would he be able to overcome it? What had Tabby's mother said at the fundraiser? "You're not going to do anything to bring shame on us." Her concern was valid. Brent Salcido's arrest and conviction had thrust the town into national news. He'd been one of the perpetrators of a 30-year-old unsolved murder. Wasn't exactly a glowing endorsement of Coventry. The town needed somebody they could trust. He wanted to be that somebody. A few of his supporters wouldn't let the photos affect their votes, but he'd never believed he'd win the election by a landslide. If he had any shot at all, he'd be squeaking out a few more votes than Farley. If just a few of his voters couldn't get past the images, what would they do? Vote for Farley, who at least had the decency to keep his sins hidden, or stay home. Either way, Farley won. Thomas would lose, Coventry would lose, and his business would take a hit. He'd always painted himself as an upstanding guy. He attended church faithfully. He led Bible study. He rarely dated. He didn't sleep around. His clients trusted him. They believed in him. His business, his livelihood, would suffer. He might have to let employees go, which meant they'd suffer. He'd have to do more of the work himself, which would keep him from volunteering, keep him from being the protector he'd once vowed to be. But the other option was to ask Senator Harrington to vote yes on the so-called health care bill, a bill that would fund more abortion clinics and ultimately lead to thousands more abortions every month. If he believed life began at conception, which he did, then that option was unconscionable. There really was no choice here, which meant Thomas was about to lose everything.